Rainbow Magic. Sky Blue Fairy. By Daisy Meadows. A magic messenger. The water's really warm, laughed Rachel Walker. She was sitting on a rock, swishing her toes in one of Rainspell Island's deep, blue rock pools. Her friend Kirsty Tate was looking for shells on the rocks nearby. Mind you don't slip, Kirsty, called Mrs. Tate. She was sitting further down the beach with Mrs. Walker. Okay, Mom, Kirsty yelled back. As she looked down at her bare feet, a patch of green seaweed began to move. There was something blue and shiny underneath it. Rachel! Come over here, she shouted. Rachel went over to Kirsty. What is it? She asked. Kirsty pointed to the seaweed. There's something blue under there, she said. I wonder, could it be Skye the Blue Fairy? Rachel said eagerly. Lackfrost had banished the 7 rainbow fairies from fairyland with a magic spell. Now they were hidden on Rainspell Island. Until they were all found, there would be no color in fairyland. Rachel and Kirsty had promised the fairy king and queen to help find them. The seaweed twitched. Rachel felt her heart beat faster. Maybe the fairy is all tangled up, she whispered. Like Fern when she landed on the ivy in the tower. Fern was the green rainbow fairy. Rachel and Kirsty had already found Fern and her sisters Ruby, Amber and Saffron. Suddenly a crab scuttled out from under the seaweed. It was bright blue and very shiny. Tiny rainbows sparkled across its shell. It didn't look like any of the other crabs on the beach. Kirsty and Rachel smiled at each other. This must be more of Rainspell Island's special magic. Oh no! Fairy in trouble, the crab muttered in a tiny voice. It sounded a bit like 2 pebbles rubbing together. Did you hear that? Rachel gasped. The crab stopped and peered up at the girls with his little stalk eyes. Then he stood up on his back legs. What's he doing? Kirsty said in surprise. The crab pointed a claw toward some rocks further along under the cliffs. He scuttled away for a few steps, then came back and looked up at Rachel and Kirsty again. Over there, he said in his scratchy voice. I think he wants us to follow him, Rachel said. Yes. Yes, said the little crab, clicking his claws. He set off sideways across a large flat rock. Kirsty turned to Rachel. Perhaps he knows where Skye is. I hope so, Rachel replied, her eyes shining. The crab scuttled across a stretch of sand. Rachel and Kirsty followed him. It was a hot, sunny day. Seagulls flew overhead on strong, white wings. Rachel, Kirsty, it's nearly lunchtime, called Mrs. Walker. We're going back to Dolphin Cottage. Kirsty looked at Rachel in dismay. But we have to stay here and look for the blue fairy. What shall we do? The little crab jumped up and down, kicking up tiny puffs of sand. Follow me, he said. Rachel thought quickly. Mom, she called back. Could we have a picnic here instead, please? Mrs. Walker smiled. Why not? It's a beautiful day. And we should make the most of the last 3 days of our holiday. I'll pop back to the cottage with Kirsty's mom and fetch some sandwiches. Only 3 days, thought Kirsty, and 3 rainbow fairies still to find: Skye, Izzy, and Heather. The 2 girls waved as their mums left. Kirsty turned to Rachel. "We'd better hurry. They'll be back soon." The crab set off again over a big slippery rock. Rachel and Kirsty climbed carefully after him. Rachel saw him stop by a small pool. There were lots of pretty pink shells in it. "Is the fairy in one of the rock pools?" she asked. "Is it this one?" The crab looked into the pool. He scratched the top of his head with one claw, looking puzzled. Then he scuttled away. "I guess not," Kirsty said. "What about here?" Rachel said, stopping by another pool. This one had tiny silver fish swimming in it. But the crab shook his claw at them and kept going. "Not this one either," said Kirsty. Suddenly Rachel spotted a large pool. It was all by itself, right at the foot of the cliff. "Let's try that one," she said, pointing. Kirsty ran over. The sky was reflected in the surface of the pool like a shiny, blue mirror. Rachel caught up with her friend. She leaned over and looked into the water. The crab scuttled up behind them, his stalk eyes waggling like mad. When he dipped his claw into the pool, the water fizzed like lemonade. "Fairy!" cried the little crab, lifting his claw out of the water. Blue sparkles dripped off it and landed in the pool with a sizzle. The entire pool was shimmering with magic. Bubble trouble. "Thank you, little crab," Rachel said. She crouched down and stroked the top of the crab's shell. The crab waved one claw at her, then dived into the water. He sank to the sandy bottom and scuttled out of sight under some seaweed. Kirsty peered into the pool. "Can you see the blue fairy?" she asked. Rachel shook her head. Kirsty felt disappointed. "I can't either. Do you think Jack Frost's goblins have found her?" Rachel said. "I hope not." Kirsty shuddered. "They'll do anything to stop the rainbow fairies getting back to fairyland." Just then, Rachel and Kirsty heard a sweet voice singing a song. "With silver bells and cockle shells, and pretty maids all in a row." "Oh!" Rachel gasped. "Do you think it's the little crab?" Kirsty shook her head. His voice was all gritty. "You're right," Rachel agreed. "This sounds tinkly more like a fairy." "I think the singing is coming from that seaweed," said Kirsty, pointing into the rock pool. Rachel peered right in. She could see something unusual in the rippling water. "Look," she said. A huge bubble came bobbing out of the seaweed. It floated towards the surface of the pool. Rachel and Kirsty watched, their eyes very wide. There was a tiny girl inside the bubble. She waved at them and fluttered her rainbow-colored wings. "Oh!" Kirsty gasped. "I think we've found Skye the blue fairy." The fairy pressed her hands against the curved sides of the bubble. She wore a short, sparkly dress and knee-high boots the color of bluebells. Her earrings and hairband were made of tiny stars, and she was holding a silver wand. "Please help me," Skye said in a tiny voice like bubbles popping. Suddenly, a cold breeze stirred Rachel's hair. A dark shadow fell across the pool. The glowing blue water turned gray. It was as if a cloud had covered the sun. Rachel looked up. The sun was still shining brightly overhead. "What's happening?" she cried. Kirsty heard a strange hissing, crackling sound. She glanced around in alarm. A layer of frost was creeping across the rocks towards them, covering the beach in a crisp, white blanket. "Jack Frost's goblins must be very near," Kirsty said, feeling worried. In her bubble, Skye shivered as ice began to cover the pool. "Oh, no! She's going to be trapped," Kirsty gasped. Skye's bubble had stopped bobbing. Now it hung very still, frozen into the ice. Skye looked very scared. "Poor Skye! We have to rescue her," Rachel exclaimed. "But how can we melt all that ice?" "I know," said Kirsty. "Why don't we